Hopefully in a good way.
In a good way.
Great. I think we can get started, yeah? Go for it. All right, so welcome everybody to our Family Affair panel. My name is Lynette. I am the library marketer for Harlequin Trade Publishing. I am joined by my fellow co-hosts, Annie and Golda from Workman and Norton, respectively. We're so excited to have you all join us. I think I can speak for my fellow publishers when I say we had a lot of fun putting this panel together. As you may know, normally we as publishers, we get to pitch our priority authors for programming, and then we leave it to the professionals to put together the final lineup. For this morning's program, Annie and Golda and I were our own bosses. So we not only want to put forth our creme de la creme, so to speak, we also really want to offer a lineup of titles that we thought might work really nicely together. And the result is this really amazing trio of titles that are also representing some of our most exciting imprints. Jen can maybe tell us in a minute if we did a good job. I think we did a great job.
Great job.
Thank you. I don't think Jen Dayton needs much introduction. She is someone who we publishers consider a tastemaker in the library space. So it is especially an honor that she's here to moderate our program for us today. Without further ado, I will pass it on to Jen.
Thank you, Lynette. That's so kind. I'm so honored to be introducing you to these three really terrific authors this morning. You would think that these stories are not connected, but they are so deeply connected. Our first author is Angela Hur. Angela is a Sparks Fellow, a Tin House alumna, and a Harvard grad. She and her family just recently moved to Stockholm, Sweden, where she told me it gets dark at 3 o'clock, which is the saddest thing ever. Angela, take it away.
Thank you all for joining us in this event. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Jen, for reading all of our books so thoughtfully and for your kind introduction. So my novel Folklorn was written over a period of a decade. And during that time, I had various writing and teaching jobs. I lived in all over the US. I taught in Seoul, Korea, and also worked in Stockholm, Sweden, where I live now. This is my second stint. This time I've come with my children and my husband. My husband is originally from Sweden. In that decade that I was working on the novel, I got married to a Swedish physicist whose PhD work, South Pole, I used for my novel, for my narrator's job, and also for extended metaphors on ghosts and memory. So yes, I married my research material. That was pretty helpful. I also had 2 children, and I also scattered my father's ashes into the sea. So there was a lot of milestones during this period, a lot of turning points, and all that fed into my novel. All that fed into endless revisions, as well as revisions of myself, my understanding of my past, understanding of my parents and their journeys. And I think most pointedly, what really helped me dig deeper into exploring my parents and their journeys was that I became a wife and a parent and an immigrant myself. I'm an immigrant mother in Sweden of 2 mixed race children who are themselves immigrants too. And so that gave me a much deeper insight into their experiences, as well as more compassion. And having young children also gave me more insight into my old childhood memories too. It gave me a different, broader perspective. So although I use all these elements from my family and from my childhood, my book is not autobiographical. It is inspired by family stories and family members, but I don't use straight realism. Instead, I use multiple genres in order to really vividly explore all these themes of cultural inheritance and biological fate. The genres that I use include the fantastic and the mythic, the surreal and the horrific, and the ridiculous and the absurd, because life is all of these things, especially now. And it's like that for many people. It has been that way for many people around the world, and definitely for my parents during their childhood and their adolescence when they grew up during a war that ultimately split their country in 2. I also use multiple genres for my novel because it's about storytelling in all of its varieties, not just cultural myths and fairy tales, but also love stories and war stories, and the conflicting childhood stories between siblings. That's also a major point in my book. It's Folklorn is about the stories we inherit and how we resist those stories and how we shape our identities. And I think even in the resistance, we are working with the stories that we inherit because we must examine and interrogate and ultimately revise and rewrite. And so the storytelling theme in my book is something that I think it's best served if I read from my prologue. So bear with me, I'll just read just a few pages from my novel, Folklorn. Long ago, not in this land but our own, the monks created giant bells, so large they could only be rung by wooden beams made of tree trunks, suspended by rope and swung against a bronze like battering rams. These bells hung in temples in the mountains, looming over us all. My mother always spoke Korean to me, but when telling her stories, she didn't sound like herself. No rich amber tones, weighted with regret. Instead, her voice hollowed, like a will-o-wisp untethered. Still, I preferred this to her looped medley of sighs, lectures, and rebuke. And while storytelling, she wasn't so tense and bristled, expecting danger to burst through the door. Maybe not the commie or Yankee soldiers she feared in her childhood, but more likely a screaming husband, raging over some slight or misstep. The back door wasn't secure either, not when thieves had broken in twice while we were sleeping, and once while we were on a semi-triumphant emigrant's visit to Seoul. Tragedy could also intrude through the phone. Maybe my father had another accident at his auto body shop while wielding his blowtorch, or maybe he'd been assaulted again, not to survive this time. Or perhaps a relative we rarely heard from died across the Pacific, leaving my mother more alone than before. But even in times of relative calm, my mother anticipated danger. With a childhood forged in war, her default mode was to always be on high alert. As an immigrant, she had to double down on her survival. Thus, her anxiety had become a constant, vindicated and put to action in times of emergency, never subsiding even when the threat had been diminished. My brother Chris said our parents were stuck in a war mentality, hoarders and preppers with cash and gold ready to smuggle across borders, and kitchen drawers stuffed with embossed napkins and ketchup packets from bounteous fast food restaurants. It didn't help that most of my father's friends were also refugees like him from what was now North Korea. Some had even served together in the 502nd, a US military battalion. They were cooks, errand boys, and interpreters back then, working for the GIs. But in my childhood, these middle-aged men and their wives convened monthly as members of the 502 Club to dance and party, pooling their resources to help each other establish dry cleaners, liquor stores, and bodegas. So how could my parents accept that the war was finally over when their immigrant village kept the specter of it alive in their drunken reminiscences, business dealings, and paranoia over hidden enemies, from both within and without, those foreign and those resembling kin? But when my mother spoke of ancient times, long before the squabbling between men and their maps and their new gods of ideology, when she revealed to me women of divine magic and elementary power, I could relax with my head in her lap, her fingers combing my hair. She wasn't really with me anyhow, wasn't even in her own body. She was warm and forgiving instead. With a stranger's voice, she told stories, inevitable and unalterable, that had been retold by countless others before her. This kept her still long enough for me to simply be with her. That is, until her stories became something else. Half-remembered dreams and recovered memories, testimonies conveyed through her as vessel, maybe the voice of an ancestress demanding vengeance. These giant bells were rung as calls to prayer, as prayers in themselves, but one monk made a bell that would not sing. He asked the villagers for money to recast it. One woman joked she was so poor she had nothing to give except her daughter. Why not take her? I've got nothing else. Later that night, the monk dreamt that the bell needed the voice of a little girl. So the next morning, he went back for the one who'd been offered. He melted the silent bell and tossed the girl into the vat of molten bronze, glowing like liquid fire. Screaming flesh bubbled and swirled with metal. The recast bell was struck again, and the sound release was so beautiful, everyone paused to hear it and weep. The echoes in the valley crested like waves through the villagers, their hearts shuddering with each passing vibration. Every time the bell was struck, it sang Emily, Emily, and that was how the child called to her mother, to everyone's mother, perhaps. I asked why the girl was singing her own name because I thought Emily was Emily in a Korean accent. My mother sighed, her disappointment in me making her familiar once more. She explained that Emily meant mommy in an old-fashioned dialect. Then she sang the bell's cry again, low and mournful, burrowing deep into my chest. Whenever I hear her sing, she said, there's only sadness, but she must be holding back a terrible, fearsome anger. When did you hear the bell, Mom? Long ago, before I came here, before I was married, on a school field trip when I was just another teenage girl with a dead mother and dead sister, both lost to war. It's a national treasure, so nobody's allowed to strike it anymore, but I hear her voice, the girl in the bell, and sometimes I hear the others too. The softest smile caressed her lips, but you'll never hear them. I've made sure of it. That's the prologue. And the Emily Bell that I feature here, I revisit in a novel through various revisions from different POVs from an academic and scientific standpoint. And the Emily Bell is just one of many Korean folktales that I retell in a revisionist feminist lens. But one story that I include in my novel is especially important to me because it is the legend of my namesake ancestress. Heo Hwang-ok is recorded in the Samguk Yusa, which is the 13th century chronicle, Korean chronicle mixing history and legend. And Heo Hwang-ok, she was a foreign princess whose parents dreamt that she would meet her husband on the seas. And so she sailed out onto the seas on a boat. And there she met King Soro, who also had a dream that he would meet his future wife. And so that's their meet cute on the high seas. And she agreed to marry him if 2 of her children would carry on her surname. And that is my surname. She is the ancestress, the founder of the specific Hurr clan, of which my family belongs to. And we have a genealogy book, which in Korean is called the Chokbo, which lists over 60 generations. And this is a story my mother told me when I was a kid, even though it's not from her family, it's my father's side. And she told me this so I would be proud of being a descendant of an immigrant princess who was also a pioneer who became a queen. And it is a story that I tell now to my 5-year-old daughter, who also moved across the sea as an immigrant in this country. And it's a story that I share now in my novel. And I hope you'll read it and that you'll enjoy it, and that you'll also wonder about the teller of how and why we shape these stories. And I hope it'll inspire you to tell your own stories and pass them on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. It was an amazing read, and I know that everybody's going to want to add this to their collections. It's that worthy. My next author is Claire Fuller. Claire was born in Oxfordshire. Hello. She's written 3 novels. Our Endless Days, Our Endless Numbered Days won the Desmond Elliott Prize, Swimming Lessons, and Bitter Orange, which was one of my favorite reads when it came out. She has a librarian husband, and Unsettled Ground is her latest book. And it's, Lauren Groff called it utterly brilliant, which it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to all the organisers. And I also wanted to say thank you to all the librarians watching for being so supportive generally of books and authors, and to any watching who have recommended my books particularly to readers. just a special thank you. And as Jen said, I'm married to a librarian, so I do actually know how wonderful you all are. But seriously, I do really appreciate all the chats that you have with readers, all the kind of recommendations that you do, kind of knowing that a book will get more readers if librarians get behind it. And obviously with me being so far away in the UK, it's even more important. So thank you. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about Unsettled Ground. It's my fourth novel, as Jen said. And it's about Jeannie Cedar and her twin brother, Julius. They're 51 and they still live with their mother, Dot, in a cottage in rural isolation and poverty. Jeannie and her mother have a vegetable patch, a big vegetable garden really, where they grow vegetables to sell, and Julius does odd jobs for people. So they just about get by. But the book starts when their mother, Dot, dies suddenly, and the adult children, for the first time, have to make their way in the world. And Jeannie is unable to read or write. They don't have any transport, they don't have any educational qualifications between them, but they do play music. And when they play music, people listen. So Jeannie plays the guitar and Julius plays the fiddle. And when Jeannie's world folds in around her, it's this, the music and her abiding love of home and of her brother that sees her through, really. So I thought I'd also tell you about how it came about, how it came to be written, and what the influences were that got me started. And like all my novels, it is a combination of things that all came together at the same time. I'm looking at different things, taking in different things, and I don't know which in that mixing pot is going to turn into a novel, but I just kind of try to soak things up, I suppose. So the first was my son, Henry, who's 25. He's got a friend called Steve-O, and Steve-O's family live out in the countryside in Hampshire, near where I live, and they have a small piece of woodland. And Henry told me that he'd been to this woodland with Steve-O, and Steve-O had shown him an old caravan that was abandoned there. And I think in the US, that's what you might call a camper trailer. It's a holiday home that's towed behind a vehicle. And there's an awful lot of these things in England. People go on holiday, own them a lot. And often when they are perhaps they've broken down, they do unfortunately get left on pieces of wasteland. So Henry had come across a really small one in this woodland, and he knows that I'm interested in unusual places, fascinated in fact by places where people have lived under extraordinary circumstances and left, and also interested in the things that they leave behind. So he said, Mum, you've got to come out and see this caravan, this abandoned caravan in the woods. And I think an awful lot of people might not want to go and see a broken down caravan in the woods, but Henry knows me well enough, and I did. So we went out there, and he was absolutely right. The place was just so atmospheric. It was abandoned, vandalized, the windows were broken, the door was hanging off, it was really quite smelly. But clearly at some point someone had been living in it, and they'd left kitchen equipment behind, some clothes, some shoes. It was just a place that made me start thinking about story. And so I started thinking about who would live in a place like that, what would take them there and why. So far from a shop, so far from a road, it would have to be quite extreme circumstances. So all that was kind of going on in my head. And then I started looking on the internet about some people who might live that way. And I came across a news story from a couple of years ago about a man who had been living in a caravan on a piece of wasteland with his sister and his mother, and the adult children were in their 50s, and the mother had died and the children had carried on living there. And the caravan had no mains water, no electricity, the siblings had no mobile phones, and one night somebody tried to break into the caravan, and the man shot the intruder with an illegal gun, and the intruder died. And the couple, these brother and sister had to run to the nearest road to try and flag down a car to get an ambulance called, but it was too late, unfortunately. So then I started thinking about the kind of people who still live with their parents into adulthood. And there are lots of people who still do that. And I do wonder, with all the pandemic and the situation of jobs for younger people, whether this is actually going to become much more common in the future. But it's still relatively rare, certainly where I live. And the people who do live with their parents into adulthood are sometimes a little bit odd in a very interesting way. So I was thinking about all that, and the final jigsaw piece really was my best friend Jill was house hunting at the time, and I was going with her to look at houses in the countryside, and she was looking at quite rural cottages, ones that were run down that she could spend some money on and do up. And we went to one where the elderly owner had clearly died and all their belongings were left behind. It was quite damp and quite run down, but it was two cottages that had been knocked together into one. So all they'd done was connect the two inside. So each cottage, which was one house, still had its own separate staircase up to individual bedrooms above. And that place also started making me thinking. So all those things came together, and as I was starting to write, and the person that I was writing was Jeannie. I usually start with a person in a place, and then I just see what happens without much of a plan. And my only plan really in this case was that at some point she would end up in a caravan like the one I had seen, but I had no idea how she was going to get there or what was going to happen to her. So I was writing, and I decided to set the novel in 1957. And I wrote the whole thing as though they were living at that time, obviously. And I did all the research, vocabulary, clothes, the kinds of things they might have grown in the garden, what they ate, what the age of the caravan would have been. I'm sure you probably know there's a lot of research when you're writing something slightly historical. And one of my first readers is, when I've finished what I consider a relatively finished draft, is my literary agent. So I sent it to her, and we arranged to meet in London for lunch, and she bought me lunch, so I knew that she couldn't be that unhappy with it. So I was quite happy with that, because it's always quite nerve-wracking. Anyway, we went through various points. She had various suggestions, which were all very good. And then at the end of the lunch, she just made a really throwaway comment to say, have you thought about making this novel contemporary? And I was just, inside I was going, no, just no way. I've written 90,000 words. I've done all the research. It's taken me two years or so to get to that stage, maybe more. Anyway, it was a very nice lunch at one of Yotam Otto Lengi's restaurants. Not that that would sway me, but anyway. But at home, I was still saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And then perhaps by the third day, I was kind of thinking, oh, well, maybe she's got a point. Well, okay then, I wonder what would happen if I just had a go. So really, I rewrote that book. I wrote another book. It's not possible to just swap the dates. It's all the research has to be done again. So I had the original 1957 book on Word on one side and a blank piece of paper on the other, and with that beside me, I kind of wrote it from scratch. There's a lot of hospital scenes in the novel, and obviously from 1957 to today that has utterly changed, and that process took about 6 months, and by the end of it I knew she was absolutely right. It was the right thing to do. So the other thing about this novel was I knew that I wanted it to have a rural setting. Our Endless Number Days was set in a forest, Swimming Lessons was by the sea, and Bitter Orange was in a dilapidated English garden. So in Unsettled Ground, as I said, Jeannie and her mother have a vegetable patch, a vegetable garden where they grow vegetables. And that's something that I've always wanted, really, a full-size vegetable garden so I could grow vegetables all year round. And I wondered whether the yearning for that came from my first ever job. So when I was 12, this was my first part-time job. I got a job in a market garden on a Saturday, and my first job was in their polytunnel, and I had to pollinate melon plants, which involved taking the male melon flower and inserting it into the female melon flower. And that was my first ever job. And perhaps even that has kind of influenced Unsettled Ground. And just to finish, I thought I'd read you a very small section. It's just a page to kind of give you a little flavour of the novel. Jeannie is in the garden digging up baby carrots. Max says that his customers like them finger-sized, which Jeannie thinks is a waste of bed space and growing time. When she stands, back aching, she sees someone in the scullery. Since Dot died, she has tried to remember to lock the front door when she is up the garden, but sometimes she forgets. She bends to get a better look and to see whether it's Stu, or God forbid, one of the Rawsons. She imagines using the garden fork to pin them to the cottage wall, the tines piercing lime render, wattle and daub. The figure, she can only see the torso through the low cottage window, seems to be moving back and forth as though examining items in the scullery. She takes the garden fork with her, prongs forwards, and goes in through the open back door. The person has gone from the scullery, and when she gets to the kitchen, a young man is peering up the left-hand staircase. "Can I help you?" Jeannie says in a tone that she hopes will suggest outrage but not fear. The man jumps and turns at her voice, and then takes a step back when he sees the fork pointed at him. It's the same young man whom Bridget cuffed in the waiting room of the surgery a week or so ago. He is wearing different clothes now, a cheap suit, the material shiny and too tight for his muscled frame. "Jeannie," he says and smiles, and she realises that it's Bridget and Stu's son, fully grown, his blondish hair gelled sideways and upwards as though a wind is coming at him from the bottom left. The shape of his head, his chin, his cheekbones make him surprisingly handsome. Did Stu look like this when he was younger? She can't imagine it. She remembers that there was some trouble with drinking on the village green late at night, making a nuisance of himself at home, and Stu kicked him out. Jeannie hasn't seen him for years. "Nathan," she lowers the garden fork. "What are you doing here? Is your brother home?" He licks his full lips. "No," Jeannie says, although as soon as the word is out, she thinks she should have pretended Julius is ill in bed or up the garden. There's something about Nathan and his veneer of confidence that makes her uncomfortable. "Can I help?" He hesitates and then says, "I've come to give you a warning of eviction." "Pardon me?" Nathan leans against the dresser. "You're going to be evicted." Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. It is really wonderful and so unsettling in parts. It was such a great read. I really enjoyed it. Next up, our next author is Michael Koresky. Michael is a film critic, screenwriter, and was the director of editorial and creative strategy at the Film Society of the Lincoln Center in New York City. He is now the editorial director of the Museum of the Moving Image, which before you all joined us, we were all saying how much we love that museum. His wonderful, wonderful book, Films of Endearment, If I Don't Meet Your Mother, My Life is Worth Nothing. Eric Carlson called it film criticism at its finest and most personal. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Koresky.
Oh, thank you so much, Jen. And I just wanted to say first, it was such a pleasure. I love going last because it was such a pleasure just sitting back and hearing Angela and Claire read. Really wonderful. I can't wait to read the books. And something that you were saying, Angela, because my book is quite different from those books. It's not a novel, and in form, in so many ways, it's so different. But what you were saying, Angela, about writing to understand your parents' journeys resonated so much because that's why I wrote this book. But I'd like to, I guess, to take a step back to kind of explain the origins of it, because it can seem like somewhat circuitous route to get to where I was, to get to the idea of the book. So yes, I'm a movie obsessive people who are movie obsessives don't question it. It's just a part of their lives. I've been like that since I was young. And I've been writing film criticism, and I wrote a book about my favorite filmmaker. His name is Terrence Davies for University of Illinois Press. And I've worked for the Criterion Collection, all these Film at Lincoln Center, now Museum of the Moving Image. Film is just my everything. It's my soul. But I don't really think often about where that comes from. You just sort of, I think we tend to think taste just kind of comes up out of nowhere. Well, that's my taste. That's why I like it. But you don't really think of where it comes from. And that's where this book ends up going. And that's where the idea came from. But I can start by taking a step back and saying that I was away with my husband on Labor Day weekend a few years ago, and we decided to watch Steel Magnolias, which is a movie that I watched a lot growing up. I never really took it very seriously outside of the entertainment value and the fact that I just love watching all of those actresses. If you don't know the film, it's from 1989. It has Dolly Parton, it has Shirley MacLaine, it has Julia Roberts and Sally Field. And the pure pleasure of the film is watching these women interact. So we watched this film just to kind of relax, and then we realized it's actually quite tragic and sad. And so we're crying on the couch on our Labor Day weekend, which was probably a mistake. But the more I thought about the film, the more I realized, oh, this is the 80s to me. It's not Schwarzenegger, it's not Stallone, it's not RoboCop. It's these movies about women. And how did that happen? And I realized going back through the decade, every single movie that starred a strong female central character was introduced to me by my mother. And I started cataloging this in my head and thinking, well, this is actually quite extraordinary. 9 to 5, Working Girl, Yentl, which is a personal favorite. I don't write about it much in the book, but it's a personal favorite of mine, anything with Streisand. And this kind of just lodged in my head. I thought about it, but not very seriously. And then a couple months later, I was home with my mom, and she's a widow, she lives alone. And one of the most wonderful things is when we just sit there with a glass of wine, having pizza or Chinese food, and talking about movies, because she loves movies as well. And I had asked her, what is your favorite era of movies? Because I'm fascinated by her take, especially because she has lived a longer time. She has been through all these different eras of film. She grew up watching movies strictly in the movie theater. There was no way to watch movies at home except for the occasional 8 p.m. movie on an all black and white channel. And so I thought that she would say the 40s or the 50s, because those are my favorite eras of film. But she said the 80s. And this took me by surprise, because first of all, true church cinephiles are like, no, it's the 40s, it's the 50s, or it's the 70s. The 80s is all this testosterone. The 80s is the era of the blockbuster. This is when movies were ruined, right? So it's like this era of pure nostalgia. But then I poked a little bit. I said, well, why did you say the 80s? She said, well, that was my first full decade as a mother. That was my first full decade when we could go to the video store and bring home VHSs and watch them together as a family. And then we just started really digging. And I thought about this more, and then I realized that her experience as a mother introducing movies to me as her son, and my experience coming of age as a child, was telling a story. And it's a story I hadn't thought of before. And I realized that I didn't know very much about my mother. And that the way that I could learn more about her was potentially through the movies. It's kind of like a language that we have. It's like a secret language, right? I'm not the kind of person that will sit down for a conversation and ask her really deep, personal, intense questions about her life. But we can get to those questions and answers if we're talking about, let's say we're talking about Places in the Heart with Sally Field, or if we're talking about The Color Purple, which is a book, one of my favorite movies of all time. So I realized a second thing, and this is why I said that this could seem a little circuitous. In thinking about these films of the 80s and thinking about the connection that we made through them, I also realized all of these amazing actresses who were headlining major studio films, this was the last true era of this. I grew up hearing, especially in the 90s and up till now, what happened to all the great roles for women? Where are the roles for women? This is very true. I mean, there are no real roles for great characters at all now. Everything has become very focused on like male teenage audiences. But the 80s was just a treasure trove of amazing, mature actresses. These were not cookie cutter roles. These were not sex symbol roles. These were fully inhabited, fully fleshed out characters. I'm talking about Lily Tomlin. I'm talking about Jessica Lange. I'm talking about Whoopi Goldberg and Oprah Winfrey when she was an actress and she was wonderful. I'm talking about Sissy Spacek and Sigourney Weaver and Deborah Winger and Cher. And so I realized this was the decade of the actress. This was the last time we had these full, rich roles. And so the book came about in a way that I would dovetail these two things. I would learn more about my mother's life through conversations with her that we could have through the actual investigations of the films. And through those films, I could also write about these women who were these amazing actresses in American cinema of the 80s. So then I started thinking about structure, and I really wanted my mother to be involved in the project. I didn't want this to just come up out of nowhere. It had to be through her, and I had to learn more, and I had to research. She was my primary research in addition to what I was going to do with the actresses. And so we decided to go film by film through the 1980s. So every year for the 80s, we would return to a film that she first introduced me to when I was a child. We would watch it again, sometimes for the first time since that first time. And sometimes it's a movie that we have shared endlessly and love watching together. So it varied between those two modes. And then we would kind of go through the course of a year. Cicely Tyson, that's a great one that somebody mentioned in the chat. We would go through the course of the decade, year by year, watch a film, and the film would bring out a theme that would relate to her life. So for example, we started in 1980 with 9 to 5. Amazing movie, actually politically very progressive. You watch a lot of 80s comedies that at one point were progressive and they seem fairly conservative now. 9 to 5 is very progressive. It was being 1980, the tail end of a very progressive decade of the 70s. Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, and Dolly Parton, basically overturning the patriarchy and taking over the workplace. It's hilarious, it's brilliant. This was the movie that started the conversation. And I used that conversation, that film, to start a conversation about her working life. I realized that even though I consider myself very close to my mother, I didn't know anything about her working life. She started telling me about job after job after job that she had before I was born, some after I was born, that I hadn't really thought about or even knew about. So that became the idea of that chapter. And then I started thinking, we watched Mommy Dearest together, which is a kind of a hilarious camp film that we've shared. But then it brought out this conversation about her own mother and the abuse that she had felt at the hands of her mother, a lot of emotional abuse and some physical. She was willing to share more of these stories than she had ever said before. So we kind of went film by film and theme by theme, and we ended up with a kind of a tapestry of the decade. And then I could also look at the way that women are sometimes treated in Hollywood, or the way that they took control of their own careers, because some of these women, like Jessica Lange, for instance, became their own producers. Barbara Streisand directed her own films and became a mogul. So taking a step back, it looks like this was an important decade for women in American film. And I don't think we've seen anything like it since. And through this, I was able to get closer to my mother. I also realized that my queerness is very directly related to this journey, and that these women were women that I was identifying with as a child. And this became a very strong through line for the film. As a child, I didn't find myself connecting with men on film in any way, but I was very drawn to these women. And it was this simultaneous, it was kind of like this almost erotic identification, right? Like, I want to be that. I want to wear those clothes sometimes. I want to be that woman. And my mother, in raising these women up on pedestals, kind of helped me realize that. So when I actually came out in the 90s, and my mother was so incredibly wonderful and helpful and unbelievably supportive of that, I felt like movies and my connection through movies had sort of laid the groundwork. And I was not going to read today because I didn't actually prepare anything. So I think my time is almost up anyway, but I wanted to also mention that what made this project seem especially urgent was that I was never able to do this with my father, who died from early onset Alzheimer's. And as much as I've always resisted talking about him, because I very belatedly started going to therapy about that, it became very apparent that this had to be one of the major threads of the book as well. And the loss of my father is something that gave me the last push I needed to write this and to actually delve into the personal, because I've always shied away from the personal in the past when I write about film. Writing film criticism is an easy way to not talk about oneself. And I felt like you can combine the two things in an honest way. And so this is a way for me to bring film criticism to an audience that maybe doesn't often read film criticism. And also for me to dig into my past a little bit and honor my father by getting to know my mother more.
Thank you so much, Michael. The one thing that really struck me about all three of your books was the mythology that we build around our families, which is something that all three of you address in very different ways, but it's there. Does anybody want to speak to that? The myths that we build around our families?
I'm something, but I didn't want to step on anybody. Yeah, you know, I guess I'll just continue very briefly on what I was saying about my father. The thing about, you know, losing a parent, especially cruelly young, because he actually he got sick in his 50s.
Wow.
Losing a parent to Alzheimer's is especially difficult because it erases a past, and then you have no real access to that past. But the thing about my father is he always was very reticent to talk about his childhood and what he went through. And so much just disappeared when he died, but there was already kind of a disappearance. Right. So his past is just, it's almost like imaginary. I don't know very much about his childhood. So I'd love to explore that one day, almost like create an imaginary past for my father as a way of giving it back to him. That's not what this book is. This book is about actually knowing more about my mother and his absence. But it's not quite answering your question about myth making, but there's certainly an absence of knowledge that fuels me.
Right. And yes, Angela.
Yes, family myth making is a huge important theme in my book to explore, because my parents also don't fully tell me everything about the war. Definitely my mom doesn't. My father does, but it was often self-aggrandizing. And so these are definitely myths that he has fashioned himself to present himself as a hero. And sometimes it will, of course, completely contradict the versions from my cousins or even my siblings. And so, which is why I also examine that in filling in the gaps and working with these myths, it's not just about understanding the truth, but I try to look at why does a teller tell these stories? Why does a teller want to present it in such a way? And trying to understand what do they hope that the listener will take from the story. So kind of looking at these different facets of the myth making and the storytelling and the story receiving sort of process is how I've approached it. Because there are things that I will probably never know, but my father was a very good storyteller too. So there is still a truth in that and how he can shape his experience from the war, for example, and him as an immigrant father, etc.
Yeah, and then I'll chip in there too. I guess there is a family myth that almost drives the whole story in Unsettled Ground. I kind of don't want to give too much away.
No, I don't either, but
but the way Jeannie has been brought up, the things she's been told, the way she's had to live her life affects everything, and then she learns that things are not as she imagined. Yeah, trying to not give spoilers there, but family myths incredibly important in Unsettled Ground. Yeah.
And the other thing that struck me also about all three of your books is that your characters get to go home to their childhood homes, which is incredibly rare in this day and age where everybody's so transient.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. Yeah, in my case, my mother still lives in the house that I grew up in. So this book is also about a continual journey back home. And before I started embarking on this project, I didn't go home quite as often. I went home as much as I possibly could. I have a life in New York. And she lives in Massachusetts. So it's like a 4-hour drive or a 4-hour bus ride often. And going home more often and being able to share that in the house where I grew up, in the same room that I watched these movies in as a child, was very powerful.
Yeah, Jeannie's childhood home, as I kind of said, means everything to her, and that also is the thing that she is trying to get back to in the whole of the novel, and the place where she was born, and the place where her mother died. And lots of people who've read all of my books have said the one common theme across them all is they all seem to feature uninhabitable houses that people still inhabit. And that's the case with Jeannie's cottage. The toilet is still outside, there's still a privy outside, they end up with no electricity, it becomes uninhabitable, and yet she still has enormous love for this place because it was her childhood home.
It's really her whole universe, this house and this garden. Yeah,
absolutely.
And Angela, your novel too. I mean,
yeah. When Claire mentioned, adult children who still live at home with their parents, that they can be odd in interesting ways. I have a brother character in my novel who has never really left, and there's a tension when the narrator was the young prodigy who left home at age 14. And who comes back home, and so the family kind of lives in quarantine and revisiting all their trauma and kind of playing all their old fights in a loop. And with that, I also kind of wanted to explore the tension between the one who leaves and the one who stays behind. And I see this with among a lot of my friends too, especially in regards to how they care for their parents. But also, I kind of want to explore that tension as a metaphor examining how there is this resentment and envy with immigrants, the ones who leave and the ones who stay behind. The ones who leave to make a new life, a new country, and the ones who stay behind in order to help build that country, or because they choose not to. And I kind of wanted to examine just how these siblings might how they view each other, how they kind of create this narrative about each other and with themselves as heroes, of course, and what happens when the one who left does return.
I'm fascinated by sibling stories. I can't wait to read both these books. And I very intentionally had to leave out I have a brother. I had to leave him out of the book for the most part. He's mentioned, but I couldn't fit it all in. But I do make reference to him at the beginning because he is my polar opposite in every way. We get along fairly well, but he's the Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Steven Seagal 80s.
So very interesting, right? You can see it in relationship to film too. Yeah.
So
and yet the siblings in Claire's book are an organic unit. One cannot exist without the other.
Very much so. But they misread. It turns out they have kind of misread each other with what Julius wants. He wants a relationship outside of the home, and Jeannie feels like he shouldn't. They should be together,
right?
Like a married couple.
Yeah. Well, all three books are amazing, terrific. I know that librarians are going to want them for their collections. And it was an honor to be able to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much to everybody, especially our host, Jen Dayton, and our authors for taking the time to participate today. We have recorded this event, so we will send out the link as soon as it's posted. Feel free to share it with any of your colleagues who are interested, or like if you came in late and you missed the beginning or something. We've also been posting in the chat the link to the digital ARCs and some other useful links that we will also send out to you later. I think all of these books sound like great candidates for book clubs, for library reads, hint, hint. And we also hope that you will all come and visit us at the online ALA Midwinter conference next week. Each of us publishers, Norton, Workman, and Harlequin, we all have virtual booths there that you can come and check out. And so I'll just say on behalf of Annie and Lynette, thank you all so much to our authors, to Jen Dayton, and to all of our audience who's listening, because you guys are doing so much work out there right now. And we really appreciate all of the hard work that you're doing. And that's all for today. Thank you so much, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Very much,
Bye.
everybody.